The subject of this video is Maurice Cowling, Fellow of Peterhouse, Cambridge. He's interesting not only for the range of his historical writing, which spans British politics, thought and religion in half a dozen significant books, covering the last century and a half, but also for his stance as a major conservative commentator in a subject most of whose better-known names are associated either with the left or with a kind of benign liberalism which he's always hated. I shall want to ask him about all of these things, but perhaps I can begin at the beginning with your early years in South London and later as an undergraduate at Cambridge. You grew up through the 1930s and were only 13 or so when the Second World War broke out. Does any of that early background seem to you to have made a difference to how you turned out intellectually?
Made me have a feeling for a conservative respectability, suburban conservative respectability. That's what I grew up in, and it's had a profound effect on the way in which I think about politics, not so much about history, but certainly about politics.
It was a lower middle class background, approximately?
That's right.
Has that coloured the perspectives on the history that you've written since?
Not really, except that I came to see it as a problem that there were groups of people, what you would now call elites, or aristocracies or classes who governed, and most of the time in the suburbs people do not see government occurring. They're really at the receiving end of government. And I think what I began to think about was, as I grew up, was who does govern? It isn't anybody I know who governs. I began to wonder how governing went on. That's, I think, the only effect that having a suburban upbringing, apart from the respectabilities, had on me. But of course there's the question why I became a historian. And I went to a very good suburban grammar school. I was taught by a very clever historian. Then I went to Cambridge very young, and I was taught by another very clever historian. And then when I came back from the army, I was much influenced by Michael Oakeshott and Herbert Butterfield. And I think what they all showed me, I wondered from time to time whether I oughtn't to be a philosopher or a theologian or even a literary critic. But I think what they all showed was that you could say anything you wanted to say through historical writing. And I don't think that's always the case. I mean, it was a coincidence of four very clever people who made it clear that history could be an attractive but really also an all-inclusive subject.
What sort of history did you read at Cambridge? What were the periods, what were the territories you did?
Well, medieval in the first year, a lot of political thought, and I did a special subject on the Tudor, the Elizabethan Church.
Who taught that?
Norman Sykes.
And was that a major influence in
No, none whatever. The influences were Smythe, who was a history tutor at Corpus, who taught me that religion is the central question in historical thinking. Butterfield and Oakeshott, who varied that message, but who really were, well, Butterfield was teaching the same message about religion. Oakeshott was a much more secular thinker. But I think there were two phases. There's a phase in 1943, when I was very, very young, and I did a year in Cambridge before I went into the army, and that was all about religion. And that focused my mind on religion. But the second phase, when I came back from the army, was much more secular in the teaching I was given, in college, and in the way, the content of what I was being taught. And I think one of the reasons why it took me a very long time to settle down as a historian and to know what I really wanted to say was that what I was taught in 1943 to 4, which did have a profound effect on me, was not what I was being taught in college by Charles Wilson and people like that when I came back from the army. The one was religious, the other was secular. And it took me a very, very long time to find out how to make the two ways of thinking I'd been given into viable historical writing.
Now, after you left Cambridge, I recall there was a period in India. Did that make a difference to the way you saw your history that you were to write later?
No, I think the thing is this. I worked extraordinarily hard. I was very precocious from the time I went into the sixth form until the time I left Cambridge at the age of 17 3/4 to go into the army of 18. And I think from then onwards, in the army and after I returned, when I came back in 1948, what I felt mainly was that I just wanted to develop. And this went on for about 10 years, 15 years. I simply wanted to develop. And I didn't get a fellowship, permanent job in Cambridge when I'd been a research fellow of Jesus for a time. I was determined not to go to red brick or what you now call plate glass. Because of that, I tried to be a journalist. I was in the Foreign Office for a time. But really, and I was a parliamentary candidate, but really none of it impinged on me strongly or directly. What I simply wanted to do was to develop so that I knew how to say what I thought I wanted to say, and also really what I wanted to say. And it was a long, complicated business. And now India plays a part in it. What I think I saw in India more than anything else, particularly when I was there, not in the army, but in 1951, and particularly in Delhi, was a small ruling class, not aristocratic ruling class, but a ruling class, governing a huge continent. And that also made me think about how governing is conducted. That's the significance of India, I'm sure.
Mm. And you were to write later, weren't you, on British relations with the Indian government and the Afghan
Well, I was
war
supposed to be doing a PhD about British rule in India from 1850 to about 1900, which is a jolly good subject. And if I'd been in a frame of mind to discipline myself to write anything, it would have been a jolly good subject. But I didn't, because I wasn't really interested in producing anything that anybody else wanted to read.
Can I go back to the journalism for a while? Did that leave its mark too on the way that the history would turn out?
There was no, I think there was only 1 year, except when I was on sabbatical, between 1951 and 1993, when I didn't teach in Cambridge. So all the time I was, well, it wasn't very long, all the time I was a journalist and a parliamentary candidate. I was teaching in Cambridge.
But it left a mark, didn't it? Because your paragraphs got sort of shorter and shorter. And
you tell me that.
There's a sort of tabloid
I don't
consistency.
know what effect the journalism had.
After failing to unrest Bassett law from the Labour Party in 1959, you seem to have immersed yourself in Cambridge teaching again, and eventually you were appointed to fellowships at Jesus College, and then in 1963 to Peterhouse, where of course you were to stay. Did you appreciate even then that you were going to spend the next 30 years writing historical books of the sort you eventually did write?
Oh, by then, yes. I was beginning to see what it was I wanted to say, and the first thing, we'll talk about the politics first. The first thing was about politics. There were two things, I think, that struck me most strongly. The first is that democratic politics are not really ever what they seem, that there is usually some other purpose or some other intention involved in a democratic politician's actions than appears on the face of it. It's not corrupt. It is simply the way in which democratic politics works, because a democratic politician has not only to make decisions, he has also to make decisions in the light of the wishes and ambitions of other politicians, and he also has to justify himself to a public which doesn't necessarily like the language which would actually describe the reasons for his actions. That the democratic public on the whole, or the democratic public in England on the whole, prefers a comfortable, liberal, problemless language, except from time to time. And democratic politicians, in order to keep power, in order to recommend themselves to a public, have to speak in a language which the public wants. Now, it isn't always or only liberal and comforting language. Sometimes it's challenging language, sometimes it's reactionary, sometimes it's nationalistic language. But the tone of English politics is liberal, even when the politician is not really himself in his private action thinking liberally. He's thinking either about how you present a policy to the public, or he's thinking about rivals within the political system, or friends within the political system. And that's really what those books are about. The other thing they're about is the fact that we do not know at any particular time what the future is going to be like. You couldn't tell in 1920, for example, that by 1924 there would be an overwhelming Conservative majority in Parliament, with Baldwin as the undisputed leader. And you couldn't tell in 1920 even that the Labour Party was going to be the main opposition party. And what I tried to show in The Impact of Labour was the uncertainty of the whole situation, and that you can't understand the situation if you think of it in terms only of party politics, that what the essence of the politics of those 4 years was a conflict between about 10 or 12 groups of politicians who were working not only as party politicians, but also across party lines, trying to reconstruct the political system, and on the whole failing to reconstruct it. But that a great deal of the thrust of the politics of those 4 years, and the same goes for 1933 to 40, is an attempt of all leading politicians, or the consciousness that all leading politicians have, that it is possible to reconstruct the party system.
In those books that you've been describing, one concept that keeps coming through all the time is that of high politics, which is a hard idea. Can you explain what you meant by it that hasn't been included in what you've just been saying?
Well, I think the thing that I left out of, not so much the impact of Hitler, where high politics is inseparable from decisions about foreign policy, and what I'm saying is that you can't understand the decisions about Hitler without understanding the high politics. But I think in the impact of labour, for example, there is virtually nothing about policy, about substantive policy issues, because I was deliberately trying to emphasize this personal and psychological aspect of political action, and not sufficiently emphasizing that any politician or any group of politicians who have power do develop their own conceptions of policy, even if they're affected in explaining their decisions or affected in making their decisions by the sense that they are part of a high political system. So I think I left, certainly in the impact of labour, I left policy out rather too much. But by and large, I think the three books present a picture of the way in which what we call high politics, the high politics of democratic political system, and particularly in England, the way in which it was conducted. And I think that is a real contribution to understanding. Though the more you say that, the more you have to aim off for what I was trying to prove. And I think I may have neglected some things in trying to prove it.
You announced all that between, say, 1967 and 1975. Why was it necessary to announce it then? What were you writing against? What were you trying to correct?
What I was correcting was a phase of public thinking which began in earnest in the 30s as a form of Marxist, Freudian socialism, the sort of student revolution of the 1930s, which was quite as strong and powerful as the student revolution of the 60s, but which had got smoothed off really by the war into a sort of naive, comfortable liberalism or liblabism, which is the dominant intellectual fashion of the late 1940s and 50s. And what I was trying to point out in relation to that ethos was that it cannot explain the way in which political decisions are reached in a democratic system. The assumption really was, and it's an assumption that you find operating in England now, but as strongly as well, is that a liberal understanding of virtue and principle makes it possible to understand the working of the political system. And I'm simply saying in those books that isn't true.
Isn't that just to say that you're really a conservative, reactionary, writing conservative prejudice in the form of history?
Well, in the first place, I'm not, as a historian, to be described as a conservative historian. I'm a conservative publicist. There are quite a number of little books and articles and things in which I'm a party conservative. But what I am as a historian is not a conservative. I'm partly a cynic, partly a pessimist, and partly, I think, if I can use jargon which isn't really mine, a deconstructionist. What I'm saying is that you cannot understand democratic politics by looking at the surface, by looking at the rhetoric, by looking at what politicians say, unless you understand them in the context in which all those things that I was talking about just now operate.
Of course, critics of that view would say that you're leaving a great deal out, aren't you? You're leaving out popular politics, you're leaving out electoral geography, you're leaving out women. Isn't there a case for including those things too as part of this context you're talking about?
They're there in the background. They're not what I'm emphasizing. And the other thing you asked me, you said they were published, those books, between 1967 and 75. This was the era of Harold Wilson. Now, your readers, your viewers may not remember, but I remember, because I dedicated one book to the Prime Minister, not mentioning Mr. Wilson. He seemed to me to embody, though I would not have voted for him, I didn't vote for him, he seemed to embody a cynical attitude to the democratic process, which was entirely in keeping with everything I was saying in my books. And he was very good, from my point of view, for the virtuous liberal, because he offended the virtuous liberal by his manifest lack of interest in virtuous liberalism. He appeared to be a cynic. And since what I was saying is that most democratic politicians are only understandable within a cynical framework, I did think that he deserved to have a book dedicated to him.
Now, as well as having a particular content that we've been discussing, these books have also got a certain method. And the method is to write a very tight narrative across a very small number of years and to make the text up out of little quotations taken from letters and diaries and so on. Why did it turn out that way? Why did the books look the way they do?
I think that you have to understand the public performance of democratic politics as being rather like a play, that there are people talking to each other with a purpose, but the purpose is not always apparent on the face of the speeches that they make. Now, I use letters a very great deal, and on the whole I believe that letters disclose better than speeches do what a politician is really up to. But the reason for making the centre of the argument the conflict between politicians or groups of politicians, and the reason for quoting little bits from them, from their letters as well as from their speeches, is to understand that democratic politics is a conflict between persons who are not necessarily telling the truth. That isn't their function. Their function is to play a conventional role in the democratic process, and the outcome of the process is the outcome of the conflict between all of the people whom I'm quoting. So that you have, 10 or 15 groups of politicians in conflict with each other, aiming for the suffrage of the electors. And the historical process is the outcome of that conflict.
I was very interested to hear the word play, because one of your best reviewers once said that you were essentially a dramatist. But if that's right, does it mean that you see your history as an act of conscious invention? Not the telling of the past as it was, but the creation of something, the knitting together of something in the present?
Well, I saw on one of the videos in this series Sir Geoffrey Elton explaining that he had never brought anything to the past, that he wasn't trying to solve his own problems by writing history. I believe that's complete nonsense. I also believe it's nonsense about Geoffrey Elton. But what I believe historical writing is the working out on a material which is present, the working out of a past which the historian really wants. Now, you haven't to cheat, and if the historian does cheat, other historians will tell him that he's cheating by referring to the material and showing that he's stretching a point or just ignoring the material. But basically what a historian is doing, and the reason really why in my own case I spent a long time feeling that I wanted to develop and not do what people told me I ought to do, which is write a book, is that what one is doing writing historical works is to take material that is present, or sometimes find material that nobody's used before, and make it do what you want it to do in order to show what the past was like. Now that's what I think I've done, and really I've always done it fairly self-consciously. And I think the account that Geoffrey Elton gave is just crude and ridiculous and does no justice to his own inventiveness.
Can I take you back now to the earliest books? Because you didn't begin with those political books, did you? The first two books, which both appeared in 1963, were concerned really with political thought. One of them was a book about Mill, and the other was called The Nature and Limits of Political Science. What were you trying to achieve in that early work?
Well, they're really both, they're the link between the writing about politics and the writing about religion in Religion and Public Doctrine. The Nature and Limits of Political Science is, it is actually, according to somebody, I can't remember who, under an authorial ban. That is to say, I don't really like it, and in a way I almost disown it. What it was trying to do was to show from the writings of academic political scientists that academic political science, as it was conducted in England in the 60s, the 50s and 60s, while pretending to be impartial, was not. That it was a liberal trick and that it needed to be shown up as a liberal trick. Now, it was a bad book, intemperately written, imprecisely written, but that's what it was saying. Now, what Mill and Liberalism, which was written very quickly, immediately after I'd written that, was saying was that Mill is one of the head and fronts of the offence that all these liberal political scientists were committing, and that he has to be understood both as a disingenuous liberal and also as having a religious message which is post or anti-Christian, and that what one has to understand, and that's what the later Religion and Public Doctrine is about, is that when you have got rid of Christianity, which is what Mill wanted to do and what very many thinkers since Mill and before Mill, but since Mill particularly, have wanted to do, you don't get rid of religion. You simply replace Christianity with another, in my view, rather bogus religion. Now that's what the Nature and Limits of Political Science and Mill and Liberalism and Religion and Public Doctrine are about. They're connected with the politics, because what I'm saying in the political books is that the impartiality of liberal socialism, which was the dominant mode in England from in the 40s and 50s is not impartial, and that it's connected in very many cases with an aversion to Christianity. When you scrape down below the surface of lib-lab political thinking, sometimes you find Christianity, but you're more likely to find a post-Christian hostility to religion. And now that seems to me a major theme, a great subject. I don't think Religion and Public Doctrine, 2 volumes have been published, and I'm writing the 3rd one now. I don't think it's really done justice to the theme, but what I'm saying is that that is a great theme and a very central theme, or should be a very central theme, in English intellectual history.
I wonder whether the book on Mill isn't as much Cowling on liberalism as Mill on liberalism. Is there part of the public world of the 1950s and early 60s in that book as its central platform?
No, I think it goes back, I'm quite clear about this, it goes back to what I was taught when I arrived in Cambridge in 1943. In fact, really, it's very clear to me that everything that I have to say goes back to what I was taught in Cambridge, mainly by Charles Smythe in 1943. There were really 2 things I was being taught. One is surreptitiously, not very openly, that one should be politically conservative. The other was that the major problem in English thought is the problem what to do with Christianity. Now, Smythe was an Anglo-Catholic. He called himself a liberal Anglo-Catholic. His sort of home was the volume published in 1926, Essays, Catholic and Critical, a famous volume. And I picked all that up. It worked itself around in my mind. And that's why when I came to read Mill systematically, actually in order to lecture on him, I could see very quickly why he should be a target. I mean, there were other targets. There could have been Toynbee would be a very good target, Hobhouse. But it was Mill that I lectured on because there were lectures to give on Mill. And it was Mill that made it clear to me that that was a subject that I ought to be dealing with. It was also political in this sense, that the impartiality of the lib-labism of academic political science in the 40s and 50s implied somehow that the sort of thing Mill was saying was true and indefeasible, that you couldn't argue against it. It was a truth beyond any sort of questioning. And that was true politically as well as in religion. So the 2 things were connected, that I was attacking a mode of political thinking, but I was also attacking a mode of theological and religious thinking. And that's why the 2 are linked in that book. And then they spread out into 2 different sorts of writing, the political and then the religion and public doctrine.
Did you ever see yourself staying in that mould of political thought and winding up like Quentin Skinner or Pocock and writing the history of political ideas?
I don't think I ever wished to be either a Quentin Skinner or a Pocock. No, I knew when I went back to Cambridge in 59, after the general election of 59, although I did still half hoped that I might be a Member of Parliament. I didn't really believe in it, and I was also determined, in a sense, not to have to go on my travels again. And I really settled from the early 60s onwards into being a Don as the main thing I was doing. And that became, it was quite clear by the end of the 60s that was what I was going to do.
As you said, there were two prongs. There was politics and there was religion. We've talked about the politics, but the religion was to lead you, when you'd finished the trilogy on politics, to turn towards this huge project on which you're now engaged, called Religion and Public Doctrine in Modern England, of which volume 3 is still about to happen. It's a hard idea that lies behind that, isn't it? Can you explain to us as simply as you can what the project really involves?
I'm saying that if you look at the intellectual life of modern England, say from about 1830 onwards, that it divides, that the works that are written divide themselves, first of all, into two categories. Those which are propounding or supporting or by implication approving of Christianity, and those which are doing the opposite, that is to say, attacking Christianity. But what I'm also saying is that many readers and many thinkers, many people who read the anti-Christian literature, there's a large secular literature which is anti-Christian, don't realize that it is anti-Christian. And that what critical historical thinking has to do is to read all the stuff, and I've read a very great deal of it, and worm out from it the position, the religious position that is being implied. I mean, one doesn't expect an essay on Somerset Maugham, for example, to be an essay on Christianity. But Maugham was a popular novelist, sold millions and millions of copies of his books. If you read Maugham with that question in mind, the question about Christianity, you see quite clearly that he is anti-Christian as Shaw or Wells or Bertrand Russell. And what I'm trying to say, I think, in the work, in Religion and Public Doctrine, is that there is a very large body of apparently neutral and impartial writing, which isn't neutral and impartial and needs to be understood for what it is, i.e. it's either post-Christian, that's to say assuming that Christianity is irrelevant and doesn't matter, or it's anti-Christian and arguing that Christianity, or assuming that Christianity is bad and anachronistic. And the function of historical criticism is to point this out. And so, I think it's also the case that quite a lot of writers who have been presented as though they're entirely secular, when they're looked at with this question in mind, turn out to be highly Christian. For example, Stubbs. Everybody knows that Stubbs believed in progress, in medieval constitution, the advance of liberty. Actually, his position is much more complicated than that. But the motivating force in Stubbs's constitutional history is a belief in the Christian character of the medieval polity. And Stubbs, after all, was not only a clergyman, he was a bishop, as well as being a very great historian.
It's obvious what any critic's going to say. How can you be sure that you're not simply taking one facet of all these people's thought and turning it into the fundamental one? whereas somebody with a different question would simply produce a different base?
Well, they have, and I'm correcting the imbalance. Whether in all the cases that I deal with, and I deal with about 150 thinkers altogether in the 3 volumes, whether I've got them all right, I don't know. All I do know is that when you ask the question in the way I ask it, then some familiar people begin to look different. Young Wordsworth, who is a much better poet than old Wordsworth, begins to look like a pantheist, egocentric enemy of Christianity. Whereas, of course, we all know later Wordsworth is going to be a very boring Anglican apologist. But later Wordsworth was a very boring poet as well. So when one looks at these people in this way, you sometimes find, I found quite often, that they look different from what you look at if you're only thinking of them in the terms of their apparent secular meaning. And I don't mind going to a text, going to an author, and prodding him and making him answer the questions I want him to ask. That seems to me what critical historical thinking should do. And you may make mistakes, but that's what it should be doing.
I want to draw this discussion to a close by looking forward as well as back. What are your immediate plans for your historical work?
Well, I'm finishing Religion and Public Doctrine. And then I think I shall probably write a short book saying what I've been saying in this last half hour.
Are you left at the age of 72 with any optimism for the future? Or do you see historical writing as being caught in some sort of long diminuendo in this world of postmodernism and deconstruction and secular correctness?
I find very few contemporary historians attract me. What do I read historically? Really the only historian who gives me undiminished pleasure is Macaulay. And if that seems to contradict almost everything I've said, that's a very good way to end this discussion.